we're starting to lose radio signal. You'll be at cruise depth soon, so refreshing and be careful. You're on your own. Good.
I don't know what Mark saw in Iron Lung when he first played it. I mean, as something he'd want to turn into a movie. It's 40 minutes long, it's $8, and it's set entirely within a submarine with nothing but audio design and tension to keep it going. But now I think I see what Mark saw. This feeling of constant dread, of existential horror, of being confined within something that is not designed to survive the trip, hopelessly completing the task at hand knowing that there really is no happy ending in sight. I also think Mark agreed with me, because the game is directly adapted for about 15 minutes and then he just does his own thing. I'm going to talk spoilers later in the video, but for now it's going to be completely fine if you haven't seen the movie. I think I should start off with the things that I liked. I think it will be the longer part of the video, but I don't know, I haven't recorded it yet. I think Mark actually did a good job with his performance. He was frankly kinda bad in Edge of Sleep, so I didn't have high expectations going in. I thought it was a bit wonky at the start. It seemed like he got into a groove the further into the movie we got. There were parts where he was just acting alone, and even screaming, but it still felt like a convincing performance. He even commits to some physicality that is pretty impressive for someone who holds so much of the production on his shoulders. Imagine the director, writer, lead actor, editor being out of commission during the production. That's a big risk, but it does pay off to get long shots of stunts that are clearly, or at least convincingly enough, done by Mark. Outside of Mark, everyone does a good job. Nobody's really hamming it up, everyone is taking it seriously and treating the story with the gravity that it needs. Even one cameo was so brief and grounded that I didn't even realize it was there. You have professional voice actors, so them performing mostly as their voice was a smart move. I know it had a small budget, but the film still had restraint in not overindulging with names that will draw the general crowd who don't know what a Markiplier is. Mark was very proud of the sound design, and I can see why. It is fantastic, and just like the game, it really helps making the movie feel the way that it does. It's dreary and dripping with atmosphere, enhancing the visuals and emphasizing moments effectively. The music was also great. The fact that every moment of the movie is filled with this music and sound is wonderful, and is one of the biggest factors in creating such a delectable atmosphere. Honestly, the whole thing could have just been a silent film, supported solely by the music and sound design, and I think it still would have been great. The editing is also consistently good. Aside from a couple sequences which are intentionally edited differently, the entire film has this minimalist, relaxed editing style that is really well done. It lets scenes breathe when they need to, but also be chaotic and disjointed when necessary. It doesn't feel like it's trying to catch your attention with unnecessarily snappy cuts, nor does it feel like it's being pretentious when shots are on the longer side. It helps elevate the horror, either through unsettlingly long shots or frighteningly frenetic shot sequences. I thought the cinematography was fantastic. To be able to make such a condensed environment feel so many different ways, and to be able to shoot it in constantly different and engaging ways for 2 hours straight is no small feat. There's always something interesting to look at in a shot. An interesting use of focus and lighting, engaging shot composition. It's enough to not make the film feel too repetitive. A lot of people question whether the movie needed to be as long as it is. I get this, as horror movies are rarely over 90 minutes, and this was 2 hours long. However, if you see it more as a psychological thriller with horror elements, more of a cerebral drama than directly a horror movie, then the length works for it. It also matches the spirit of the game, which is a 40-minute long, slow burn, as the movie echoes this with slowly building up the sense of mania and paranoia that wouldn't have been as effective if the movie had a quarter of it chopped off. On that point, I do appreciate that it wasn't just a typical horror movie. It didn't focus on necessarily overwhelming you with scary monsters and jump scares. Instead, it just keeps building onto this tense atmosphere, and has a lot of elements of body horror and cosmic horror, as well as things like claustrophobia and thalassophobia, not making you jump because of loud and surprising noises, but instead gnawing at you with a sense of inevitability and dread. The film is an exceptionally well-constructed descent into madness. The fact that the movie starts with relatively low-key and unassuming vibes and ends the way that it does, all while feeling like a natural and justified evolution that builds on the foundation of the game, results in something that feels emphatically proud of its source material while elevating it into something more. Now is when I talk about the things I didn't quite like about the movie. I do think that the first half of the film overindulges in show and tell, as they will show something and then explain what that thing means. It makes sense because it can be a confusing world to enter into, and things do need to be explained, but I think the exposition could have been delivered more naturally. The first half also feels somewhat repetitive, and if you know the game then you'll know what about it is repetitive. This is mostly addressed in the second half, but it does make the first half feel like a bit of a slog. Which I know has become a thing that a lot of people have to say about the movie, but I do have to agree, even if I do like how slow-paced it is. There is one shot of visual effects that sort of pulled me out of the moment. It gave me the feeling of seeing a video game cutscene. Which was very odd considering it's preceded by great practical effects and preceded by exceptional visual effects. I think it's a bit funny seeing how scuffed up Mark's character gets throughout the movie. He gets tossed around and injured, sometimes pretty severely, and he mostly is able to shrug it off, or at least not be as impacted as he should have been. It's like this for a lot of movies, but for this type of horror movie I thought they could have done a bit more with his physical condition. I'm not saying that it doesn't, I just thought it could have done so more. The addition of more dialogue compared to the game results in a lot of time when nothing's really happening aside from the characters just talking to each other.
Oxygen notification.
This would be fine, but the movie has a built-in ticking clock that makes the moments where Mark's character is asking questions, or reiterating things, or moving around slowly kind of annoying because it's reiterated multiple times that he needs to be quick. There is a lot of downtime in the movie, and like I said, I do appreciate the slower pace, but it can make the in-between moments feel boring or overlong. It is refreshing to see it, as opposed to other movies that have come out recently that feel the need to imitate a TikTok style of editing where everything is always happening constantly all at once. But the flip side of that is that some moments do tend to drag a little bit. However, there is a big issue, and I'd say it's big because I think it affects the entirety of the movie, and that's the dialogue balance. I thought it was troubling how much Mark boasted about his audio mixing being done at Warner Studios on Distractable, and I'm sure that high-quality equipment sounded pitch perfect to him, but for the majority of people who will watch the movie, the mixing just isn't great. No, not that it isn't great. I seriously think it's a detractor for the movie. There is a substantial amount of dialogue in the movie, especially compared to the game, and I'm sure that most of it is great, but the issue is that I couldn't hear about 80% of everything all the characters said. Mark's character often mumbles or talks softly, and other voices are heard through heavy distortion or effects that accompany by the sound design and soundtrack become almost indistinguishable. Instead, you're watching this raw, incoherent sound, which can evoke intense and chaotic moments, but when there's a dramatic moment where the dialogue is important to define characters, rules of the world, or the narrative, and you just can't hear it over everything else going on, the experience is muted. Maybe watching the movie with a better audio setup or with headphones or even with subtitles will solve this issue, but the fact that it's an issue at all, and present in the format majority of people will be introduced or simply experience the movie, is pretty unfortunate. My brother told me to calm down about the dialogue mixing, but I do think it's actually the biggest issue with the film. And seeing what other people have had to say, it seems to be a common problem that people had, so it's not entirely my individual subjective opinion. And it's not even just an aesthetic thing. I genuinely missed out on character motives, justifications for their actions, and I assume much more that I question of the film that would have been answered if I could just understand what the characters were supposed to be saying. Right now we're going to be entering the spoiler section, so you can skip ahead to see my final thoughts. Just a spoiler warning. They changed the big fish, which was an interesting adjustment. I know that a bunch of the marketing already had the different fish with the poster and the popcorn bucket, but I actually like that they changed it to this actual horrific, incomprehensible monster, and not just a slightly annoyed frog. It really enhances the horror, along with how they make the creature actually intelligent. There were a couple moments of unexpected comedy that I did enjoy. I found Mark finding the life jacket in the submarine deep under the blood ocean, as if that's going to help at all, to be quite funny. It's good because for something as bleak as this story is, it's important to have moments of levity. A small thing I liked was how they used the photos. First, defining it as an X-ray camera makes the photos taken within blood understandable, but it's also used to create a pretty effective plot point. Mark's character, angry at the people he's doing the expedition for not properly informing him of what he was getting into, takes a photo of all three that are working on the project, only to learn it's a high-powered X-ray machine that has now given radiation poisoning to all the crew members. This emphasizes that the protagonist is not a very good person, but also someone who's genuinely regretful for his actions, and creating a deeper relationship between his handlers, rather than just being some faceless company sending them to die. While I think the game is cool for presenting the dehumanization that can be done in the name of science, the humanization of the crew does work in making a more effective narrative for the film. Also, when I first saw the group having their photo taken, and all we saw were their skeletons, I thought they were just straight up vaporized by the sheer brightness of the camera. But instead they went with the X-ray radiation angle, which works better for the narrative, but it would have been crazy if they decided to kill off all the supporting characters and truly let the convict be alone. I also have questions regarding the X-ray camera. Were the bones the convict saw in the ocean actually a skeleton, or was it a real body that he tried to get a sample from, not just bone? And also, if it is a skeleton, are we assuming that the big fish has an exoskeleton? Because otherwise, we see big fish, fleshy skin and all, despite it being an X-ray. They also changed how the camera took photos, being a bright white light followed by the image, which then fades out into a negative. It's a really cool effect, especially when compared to the game, which just had the image appear and then disappear whenever you moved the ship. And the brighter light also allows them to play around with lighting and make it a resource that the convict has to be cautious of. The light goes out, so he has to use the brief flashes to be able to see anything within the ship, which can be a bit repetitive when we see him repeatedly hitting the light while trying to fix the computer over and over, but I do think its use as a story mechanic was inspired. My favorite thing in the entire movie is how they used the convict's name. I initially didn't like that they gave him a name, as it felt unnecessary, and like any number of adaptations where a nameless character is given one. It usually just feels underwhelming, especially to see Mark play the convict, whose real name is Simon. However, I'm so glad they gave him a name because it resulted in the best moment of the whole movie. Simon, in a hopeless situation where he thinks there's nothing that he can do but sit and wait, takes a photo and ends up showing the big fish. It starts to retreat down this tunnel as he keeps taking more photos, and so to alleviate his desolation, he tells the fish his name is Simon, and to tell the people who are looking for him where he is located. It's a funny little joke of humanizing Simon by talking to this thing that doesn't understand him to get help. I think some people laughed at my theater, and it was a funny moment in the film. After that, a long time passes and Simon gets even further into his madness. It gets to a point where he's talking to this voice that he is convinced is a hallucination, as the speaker that he's talking to is broken. Then, out of nowhere, the voice says his name, despite him never mentioning it. He thinks this is part of his hallucination, and starts to go off at the voice for knowing his name when it shouldn't know his name because he never mentioned it. Then the voice admits he did indeed tell it his name, and then it clicks. The voice wasn't a hallucination. It was the big fish that was manipulating Simon into doing as it wished, remembering his name for when he called out to it earlier. This was such a clever and subtle twist. Well, it took me a bit to realize it, and my brother didn't realize until after the movie and I had to mention it to him. It trusted the audience to put the pieces together, which really makes the hand-holding in the beginning of the movie seem a bit amateurish, but it is fine. I also absolutely adore the surreal elements of the movie. The game is more subtle and grounded, but the supernatural elements of the big fish communicating with Simon having these hallucinations or premonitions, the whole Into the Light sequence, which features the iffy VFX that I mentioned earlier with the big fish, and basically the entirety of the second half is really effective, despite how distant it feels from the first half. I initially thought it was a bit bizarre to give Simon a backstory though. Iron Lung doesn't feel like a game that needs elaborate character backgrounds to be enjoyable, but I do think they end up doing it well. Outlining him as a terrorist motivated by hopelessness but filled with this immense grief over the deaths that his actions have caused makes him much deeper than this nameless, faceless convict of the game. It also gives him an arc of starting as this pessimist, believing in the hopelessness of the world, and following some prophet that encouraged his nihilistic worldview, to actually believing the cause he was sent down on the submarine to accomplish, and ultimately happily giving his life for the purpose to potentially save humanity. If I'm being entirely honest though, I do think his turn comes a bit too late in the film. He spends the entirety of the movie just wanting to go home and wanting to make deals with his handlers, even though he keeps being told it's impossible. But then only when his handler Ava is killed does he decide to go out fighting and accept his death, then just mope about. I thought it was funny that Simon ends up looking like Bootstrap Bill. This isn't a positive or a negative, it was just an observation. As I mentioned in the non-spoiler section, Simon does get beat up a bunch, but his injuries aren't really covered. He initially gets thrown around a ship, apparently by the waves, and tumbles over his chair, but he's mostly fine. Then he's dropped in the submarine and lands flat in his face, which only seems to bloody his lip when it would have at least broken his nose. Then he falls from the top of the submarine to the bottom, and hits the back of his head against a metal wall, hard enough to create a permanent dent. And he does mention he thinks he has a concussion, but it's hard to tell how much of what happens after is due to the concussion, was caused by the big fish, or actually did happen. I guess it's up to interpretation whether Simon was straight up killed from hitting his head, and everything that followed was some post-death hallucination, or there really was some supernatural power influencing his thoughts, and the injury just didn't really affect him. He also ends up scraping his arms as he's prone in the crawl space, and he covers them up with bandages, which does come up later as his body is being transformed through the gashes on his arms, but he never mentions them between being bandaged up and him removing the bandages at the very end. There's also a moment where he vomits blood. I don't know what was up with that because it's never brought up again. The movie also ends with him ripping off his own arm, which certainly would have killed him, if not left him in shock. But he still has the wherewithal to clutch onto the black box and protect it as the ship is being chewed up by big fish. This one is less severe since he literally does die pretty immediately after he rips his arm off, but it was a bit goofy to see him with his little bony stub and still focusing on the mission. My last note is that there isn't an after-credits scene, but there are headshots of cast and crew throughout the credits. This ends with the headshots of Chica, Mark, Amy, and Henry, which was sad to see, but also nice to know that he's being remembered in something so significant. Overall, this was much better than I was expecting. I know Mark made a joke on Distractable about people going in with low expectations, and telling people it's okay if it's terrible, because we're fans and they're here to support him, and he's a first-time director, so don't think too big. Mark has directed plenty of things before, and while none are really on this scale, they were all still demanding and significant works of filmmaking. He knows what he's doing, at least a little bit, and you can see it in the film, and how he's talked about it over the last 3 years. Every technical aspect is on the level of any seasoned filmmaker. The cinematography, lighting, editing, pace, and tone are all unexpectedly high quality from a debut filmmaker. Mark's performance was eons better than his previous dramatic acting, likely because he was writing for himself and could perform it however he wanted. Everyone else from the cast and crew did their jobs extremely well, making this film that is not only competently made, but genuinely well made. It still has the glaring issue of the dialogue balance being pretty bad, but that's an issue that could be fixed for further releases of the movie. There are also some other issues I had, and the pacing can be a big drawback for people who lack patience. And I'm sure for someone who knows nothing about the game, the movie may not do the best job in sharing everything there is to know. However, I think the movie is more than worth your time. It's good to support independent filmmakers like this. Creatives who don't need to be distributed by one of the most prestigious companies to be considered legitimate filmmakers. Mark went his own way, delivered his creative vision, and poured years of work into something that feels entirely passionate and engaging. I usually avoid them like the plague due to their reputation, and even though the sentiment has been said about pretty much every one that is released recently, I truly think that Iron Lung may just be the best video game adaptation ever. No compromise, expands on the world while remaining respectful, takes the source material seriously, and is actually well made. More of this, please. Now that I'm thinking about it, maybe Mark should have directed the Five Nights at Freddy's movie. It probably would have been better than whatever FNAF 2 was. Addendum, I record these under my bed sheets because it has good cover for the sound, and it's summer where I am, and it's so hot. I'm dripping with sweat. So I just wanted to say I was trying to recreate the circumstances that Mark finds himself in Iron Lung, where it's super hot and he's sweating. I feel you, Mark. I feel you.